You're listening to On Target with Larry Sparano, your source for what is, not what other medias tell you it is. Unbiased, unafraid, and always on target.
Good afternoon. I'm here again, Keystone Radio, WKCV 103.5, coming out of Waupun, Pennsylvania. And on the line with me today is longtime newsman Bryant Thomas, most recently of the AP division in Washington, D.C. AP Newsman Bryant Thomas is with us on the line today. Bryant, today we're going to talk about what's going on with the presidential race as we're getting closer now to the first primary and the first caucuses. And Bloomberg is suddenly a new element, a late bloomer, so to speak. Does he stand a snowball's chance in hell?
Well, that's a very good question. I think nobody gave Tom Steyer the time of day, and look where he is now in the polls. All you got to do is spend money and get your name out in front of voters, and people begin to react to what you're saying. Now, Bloomberg has got much more money to spend than Tom Steyer because he's much richer, and he's also paved the way for this run by funding many of the races that were won by Democrats back in 2018. He spent an awful lot of money helping Democrats retake the House. So he's already got a footprint in the Democratic Party process, and we'll see whether that continues to have traction.
But won't Bloomberg be hung with descriptions of him being just a rich billionaire from New York who wants to buy the election?
No, I don't think so, and here's why. I think if you look at his background, his tremendous efforts in philanthropic regions of the country, he's got a tremendous gift in terms of his taking care of his own employees, and that's totally different from most billionaires who just accumulate money and don't care how they do it and who they step on and all the other criticisms billionaires sometimes get. So I think that, they may try to ring this type of thing around his neck, but look, we've got a rich man in the White House now that many people are very, very unhappy with, and I don't know that necessarily being rich is a detriment to running for office.
Yeah, but he still is going to be seen as a billionaire, and maybe the philanthropy is really just a form of PR, which often occurs with people like that, rich people who want to put on a good public front. But again, he's already being attacked by Sanders and by Warren as being somebody who thinks that he could buy his way into the presidency, and someone who's more on board with the corporations and the rich people than he is with the working class. How's he going to get around that?
Well, I think, Sanders has very little room to talk about being an outsider, considering he's still an independent running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and no one wants to talk about that one.
Yeah, but he's not. I
think that's a kind of a specious criticism on his part.
Yeah, but he's not a billionaire.
He is the supreme outsider.
Yeah, but not just the outsider argument. That's not really the argument against him. The argument is that he's trying to use his money to buy the presidency, and he doesn't identify with the working class and their problems.
Well, I think if you check his record of philanthropic and other social interactions, you'll find that there is an attempt by Bloomberg to stimulate wealth, to make life better for working class people, and he's stated that in his opening policy when he announced his candidacy just yesterday. So I think that you got to give this time to settle out, and the sniping was going to occur, and he knew that when he started. That the minute he became a candidate and people looked at $54 billion in wealth as a campaign war chest, that obviously they were going to have to gird against that kind of stuff. So let's see how he does after the first month or so, both in terms of criticism and in terms of where he stands in the polls. And then we can make a more informed judgment about whether any of the negativity that might be associated with his campaign might stick.
But do you think that just a massive advertising campaign would be enough to gather a wide spectrum of the voting population, not even considering Trump's base, but just mainstream Democrats, crossover Democrats, and conservative Democrats? Can he get, in other words, can he get enough of these coalitions together, along with mainstream Democrats, to actually put them over?
Well, that's going to be the challenge. If he can do that, and I think the fact that he went to Norfolk the other day to announce his candidacy gives you an idea that he wants to be somebody who can compete in all of the sections of the country where crossover voting is key to winning elections, and certainly Virginia fits that bill now. If he does that, if he is successful in hitting the like where you are now in Pennsylvania and in areas throughout the Rust Belt where Trump did well, and more importantly in the big states like Florida and Texas and California, if he can show that he's an active, viable candidate in those parts of the country with working class people, and the only way he'll do that is go out and touchy-feely with these voters. If he can show that he can do that, then you might see poll numbers really start to move in his direction. But, it's early.
If he gets the nomination, the Democratic nomination, does he really stand a chance at competing well against Trump in debates and just in the campaigning as it goes along? Trump is already diminishing him as Little Michael.
Well, of course, anybody who dares to run against Trump gets a nasty moniker. That's a given. That's how he bullies his way through all of the Republicans that he was facing in 2016. Some people resonate with that sort of stuff because it's new, it's different, it's beyond the parameters of what politics used to be like. And I think that thing that's missing in Trump's war chest is results. He's promised a lot of things and delivered very little, and sooner or later he's going to have to explain that.
That could be catching up to him as we get closer to the election. But, assuming that Bloomberg is a Democratic nominee, on stage, can you envision him competing well against Trump in a debate?
Probably not as well as some of the other candidates might do. But, if he wants to do this, if he wants to become the Democratic nominee, he's going to have to learn how to be a pit bull. And this is what most all Democrats, in my view, having watched them now for 45 years or so, have lost the ability to do, and that is go for the jugular and say it convincingly and believe it, more importantly. If you look at what the Republicans have done since Lee Atwater with Michael Dukakis and Willie Horton, it doesn't matter whether it's true. All you have to do is say it often enough and loud enough, and people begin to believe it. And this is exactly what Goebbels did back in the 30s with the Nazis.
Yeah, okay, but again, the question is whether Bloomberg is capable of countering that, because he is a very dry guy. Now, this has nothing to do with his qualifications or his overall view of how to conduct a presidency. But in terms of, we both worked in electronic media and news. We know how that works. It has to be colorful, it has to be concise, it has to be punchy. It could even be a little crazy to engage the public, to listen, and to look. I mean, how is Bloomberg going to rise or perhaps fall, if you want to call it that, to that level where he's actually a good, effective counterpuncher to Trump?
Well, I think if he gets enough traction to become a candidate on the Democratic stage, you'll get a flavor for what he can do against Trump. If he's, wimpy and uncertain and incomplete on what he offers on the debate stage with the Democrats, just imagine what Trump's going to do to him.
All right, how about this? Could he project himself, market himself as Trump 2.0, a Trump who is sane, a Trump without the craziness, but still trying to fix the problems perhaps more successfully he would be than Trump has been, with all the problems and all the frustrations of the working class that got Trump elected to begin with? Can he pull it off as a saner Trump?
Perhaps. The issue is getting through the Democratic process, the Democratic Party process. That question you asked is more akin to the general election rather than the primary process, which he must go through first in order to become the nominee. I think what has to happen is you must, crawl before you walk. And I think that even if he's got a lot of money to spend on advertising, and certainly he does, he still has to present himself as someone who can take Trump on, and more importantly, vanquish the Democrats who are now in line for the nomination. It's a tall order, and we'll see how he does. Everybody, blew off Tom Steyer in the beginning, and look where he is now. He's, 5-6%. And he's on the debate stage, which nobody ever thought would happen. So I think, anything is possible in this political climate we've got now. I mean, Trump changed everything in terms of the viability of candidates to compete for the presidency.
Well, what you seem to be saying is that if he's successful in the primary process, that will fine-tune him, hone him to take on Trump. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. But he's got to crawl, as I said, before he walks. And let's see how much crawling he can do here in terms of bringing himself up in poll numbers and, more importantly, in acceptability to voters. See how he does when he goes to coffee shops in Iowa and New Hampshire and town meetings in traditionally swing districts where those votes are critical to anybody who wants the Democratic nomination.
And what do you make of the number of candidates? I mean, there are just too darn many at this point. Isn't it diluting the whole approach of any one of them because there's so many out there?
Well, look, the Republicans had a lot of staying power in the 2016 campaign. They didn't start dropping out until the primaries were underway. So I don't think that's anything that's a detriment at this point. You know, when the votes start coming in Iowa and the caucuses there and the primary in New Hampshire and then the primary in South Carolina and the caucuses in Nevada, after that, you're going to have a real feeling for who's going to have the staying power to remain in this race. And that's when you're going to see the candidate count drop. There won't be any way around that for the people who do not do well.
Who do you see basically as the survivors, and who do you see as the strongest candidates going into the nomination?
Well, I was shocked with Buttigieg's performance in Iowa. Then again, if you look at what he's done, he's been there in the hustings for weeks, carrying his message, which resonates with voters. And I think that, more importantly, it resonates with independent voters, which is what you're seeing in terms of his support broadening, and conservative Democrats certainly, which Iowa is full of. And if you see the fact that he's now either number one or number two in New Hampshire, depending on which poll you're looking at, he may have a shot at dethroning somebody who's in the number one or two position. We don't know. This is a strange setup. You know, if Buttigieg does well in Iowa and New Hampshire and can engender himself to blacks in South Carolina, which is his big challenge now, then you might see something in terms of Buttigieg being a real candidate to be reckoned with.
Or
if he falters in South Carolina, then it's much harder.
He has a good ground game in Iowa. Now, New Hampshire, the same thing? Does that also account for his popularity there?
I think so. I mean, he's got appearances here. He comes here frequently, and I'm in New Hampshire, so I can tell you that the people who go there seem to be impressed with what he says. And he's articulate. He served in the military, and I think that he's presenting a lot of the things that are part of the frustration of middle America. And I think he's got more rational solutions and more realistic solutions in terms of offering something for voters to latch on to than Trump ever did.
Well, two elements here working for him and perhaps distorting the amount of support that he seems to have. Now, I think some of his rise in the polls is distorted because, don't forget, Iowa, the caucuses are very few voters, and as you say, he's been working the ground there. And also New Hampshire, the same thing. And I think the most active people are those that are the most committed on either side. But, whether that would translate beyond Iowa and New Hampshire, I don't know, although, there is such a thing as the bandwagon effect. Those who win Iowa and New Hampshire, it gives them more energy and more notice and apparently, more gravitas going into their primaries, which again is a false indication, but, bandwagon effect is a big element.
There's no question about that. And don't forget, the primary schedule is different this year than it was back or next year rather than it was in 2016. Super Tuesday is much earlier. You only have 4 races, the 4 that I mentioned before Super Tuesday. And that's a big difference. Super Tuesday was much later in March 2016 than it is this year. So, one of the things that you're going to have to look at is how these candidates posture themselves in the states on Super Tuesday after Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina. That's going to be a big challenge for many of them who are on the cusp of being eliminated, and even for those who might be seen as the best candidate to take on Trump. And I speak, of course, of Joe Biden. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty among Democratic voters that Biden's got what it takes to really knock Trump off, even though nationally he continues to enjoy poll numbers that show that he's clearly ahead of Trump. If you factor in some of the Rust Belt states, then it gets more cloudy. That's what Democrats are fearful of, that Biden will not have the staying power needed to knock Trump off.
Now, what about Warren and Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard? And any others that you find are strong candidates in your estimation?
I think Warren is definitely going to be a factor, but if you start looking at some of the national polling that indicates that her position against Trump is not nearly as good as some of the others, Biden remains at the top of that list, followed by Sanders. And Sanders and Biden can flip depending upon which poll you're looking at. And I think that as this thing begins to tighten up, as we get closer to the Iowa caucuses, and especially to the New Hampshire primary, you may see some poll numbers start shifting that heretofore have not been very, very movable. And that's a big deal. And if you start seeing big shifts in polling in some of the key states, I mean, big shifts, I'm talking about 7, 8, 10 points, then you'll get a better idea as to who might have the staying power to be in this race as we approach Super Tuesday.
How much of a factor will all the noise be that the Democrats are making about impeachment into the election?
Everybody thinks that they're going to go forward with the impeachment process, and there's plenty of indication that this is appropriate. What Trump supporters don't want to hear is the I word. They don't think he did anything wrong, that he ever can do anything wrong, and that's just not factual. So I think that if the Democrats go forward with impeachment based upon what they have now, and that's obviously not as juicy as if there's other things that might be available with McGahn's testimony and Bolton's testimony, if that ever occurs, things might, gel a little more. But even absent that, it's the responsibility of Democrats to do what they were elected to do and the Constitution that they swore to uphold and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It is an obligation they have as elected officials to do what the evidence suggests that they do. All they can do is bring it to the floor of the House, have a vote, and assuming it passes, then it goes to the Senate. And if the Senate, in its wisdom, decides that this is not going to go anywhere, then that's true, that the system has worked, and that's important. We cannot avoid an impeachment simply because it's not politically popular. That's crazy. That's not what the Founding Fathers envisioned with the impeachment process. There were, even in the debate over impeachment when it was being put together in the Constitution, there were those who said, well, look, you can always have another election. Well, what happens if in the interim period a president starts all kinds of international trouble, becomes subservient to foreign governments, continues to do things that are not legal, then you have a real issue. So that's why the impeachment clause is in the Constitution, and that's why Democrats have to follow through on their constitutionally sworn duty to provide. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Look, it didn't work with Bill Clinton on something that is clearly far less egregious than what Trump is facing. But it was still allowed to play out, and I think that's important.
All right, put that aside about their constitutional duty and all that, and I don't necessarily agree with your take on that and whether this really rises to the level of removing a president, but put that aside. And let's just assume it should be done. They're actually compelled to do it under the Constitution. But what I'm really getting at is, what's the public reaction going to be to that, short of removing him? If they just go through this and he's not removed, does that give Trump more strength or does it weaken him?
It depends upon how the public portrays this trial as to whether it's a factually based narrative or whether it's something that is purely political. And, impeaching a president has become a political circus. That's even in the 3 episodes of impeachment that we have been alive for, let alone the Andrew Johnson thing, which was, way back when. But in our lifetime, we've seen 3 impeachment situations. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, all you have to do is wait for the public to move into the evidence and make informed judgments on the evidence, not on somebody's political catcall, to make sure that what the public is seeing is what's actually going on, and more importantly, what they say to their elected representatives about the impeachment process.
In what political universe does an informed electorate act the way you are wishing that they would? First of all, a lot of people are not informed because they choose not to be. They'd rather watch something on TV rather than that political circus. And secondly, the media isn't really informing people objectively. So considering the disinterest of large numbers of the population and the difficulty for those who even make a sincere effort to find out the truth, the difficulty because of media taking sides and not being objective, I mean, how would that happen in this case where people are really making objective, well-informed decisions on whether Trump should be removed?
Look, the whole process is much different from what it was during the Watergate situation with Nixon, because you only had television and radio at that point and newspapers that were the primary link to voters and what was going on in their government. Now you have all of these extraneous sources of information that are not necessarily vetted properly. In fact, many of them are not, to provide accurate review of what's going on in the political process and in the impeachment process. So you're right, it's very difficult for voters to get accurate information. It's not impossible. And I think that if voters are truly on the fence about whether Trump should be impeached, then it's up to those voters to become informed and pass that information on to their elected representatives.
But again,
if they
Brian,
don't want to take the time to do that, then they deserve the government they get.
Well, again, Brian, how many people are going to be willing and able to do that? Realistically speaking, I mean, we know how disinterested the public is generally in the minutia or even in the general outlines of the issues, let alone how convoluted this has all become and how politicized it's become. So, I mean, realistically, what are the chances of people, saying, hey, I've got to really become informed and make an informed decision? Realistically, is that going to happen?
I don't think to the degree it did with the Watergate situation with Nixon. But don't forget, it took months and months and months for the tide to swell against Nixon.
Yeah, he was reelected with a huge majority. He had just won re-election.
And then even after the impeachment process was begun and the hearings were underway by the Watergate Committee, there was no traction for impeachment until the tapes became public after the Supreme Court ruled that they had to be released.
And that's
So that's the kind of thing that's absent in this whole thing with Trump so far.
Yeah, we don't have
that big smoking gun.
Exactly, and from my assessment, they're not likely to come up with anything like that. It's just more of the same that's been going on for months and months now. Actually, from the day he was elected, they've been trying to get him one way or the other, and swelling issues up, far beyond their importance. And I think the huge difference between Watergate and what's going on today is Watergate was a much more serious, blatant, and obvious crime, break-in of Democratic headquarters, where the White House was aware of it and elements of his administration were actually coordinating it. So, I mean, there's no comparison with the seriousness of what was going on with Nixon and what became more and more obvious with the release of the tapes and what's likely to occur here, unless there's something, hidden that we don't know about. I think it would already have been revealed by the Democrats who are out to get him tooth and nail.
Well, I think that there's a certain group that wants to avenge the loss of 2016. Is it the majority of Democrats? No. But the Republicans are playing it that way because they know that they can make fodder with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's the Goebbels effect again. The oftener you say it, the longer you say it, more people will begin to believe it. It doesn't make it true.
And for those,
but it doesn't seem to matter.
For listeners of ours who may not be familiar with Goebbels, we're born decades and decades after the Second World War. Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda minister and quite effective in propaganda, even using the relatively primitive electronic media and other media of his day. It was effective. You're saying now it's become much more refined.
And much more targetable. That's the thing, is Goebbels could have made a mint with this crew. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And the fact that you could tailor this message to say anything you want and just stick it out there and see what sticks to the public psyche, that's totally different from the 1930s.
Well, that gets back to what we've discussed a number of times previously. that the Democrats, for some strange reason, have never gotten up to speed on how to get their message out to the public in an effective way, where the Republicans, who used to be the stodgy people, have become very adept at providing colorful, precise, on-target messages, just like Fox News does, and which is why Fox is so popular. Even though a lot of it is baloney, they know how to package it, they know how to present it. How come the Democrats never learned how to do that? They used to be the working class party that knew how to talk to people, or to regular people, how to talk in common terms. Now it's the Republicans that are doing that, and Democrats are all idealistic, intellectual, and abstract, and it's not working. How did that happen?
Well, I think if you look at the 2018 election results, there are storm clouds on the horizon here for a lot of Republicans. Mm-hmm. So some of it may be changing. If you look at the ground game that the Democratic chairman, Perez and Ellison, created in 2018, they said they were going to compete in many of the Republican districts where they felt that they could make inroads. And they did. They knocked off a sitting congressperson in Orange County, California, where nobody thought they would have any success. So I think if you get the ground game functioning properly, with the messages that will resonate with the people within those districts, whether they're Senate districts or House districts, then the Democrats have a much better chance of prevailing.
Well, the winning issue for them back there was health care. Is going to be,
and they're still going after that, and they should, because health care is the big concern of the American people.
But again, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, because now the Republicans are able to criticize Medicare for all, universal health care, how people are going to have to give up the health care plans that they want. So the Republicans are already successfully, to some degree, attacking the plans that are being put out by Sanders and by Warren.
That's true, and I think you're going to see some of that start to coalesce around plans that are not nearly as aggressive. I think the Buttigieg plan to allow people to keep the private insurance that they have, unless they want to opt into the public plan, is probably the least offensive way to get the message across to voters, and the least toxic way in terms of losing votes. You get back to the fact that Trump has promised much but delivered very little. And that's not a recipe for re-election, especially when your negatives are in the mid-50s, where his are. His positives are not any higher than they ever were. They're in the low 40s, and low 40s is not a great position for an incumbent to be in, try to get reelected.
All right, wrapping it up now, last element to discuss here. Do you see any surprise candidate emerging or being presented at the last minute? There's already talk about Oprah and Michelle Obama. Are those the rabbits that are going to pull out a hat at the last minute, at the nominating convention, and just declare them the nominee? I mean, do you see anything apparently crazy like that happening?
No, I don't. I think that would be insurrection among the voting public who decides the candidate in these primaries, and that would cede the election to Donald Trump. I just don't see that happening. And, I think that from a standpoint of the two names you mentioned, if Michelle Obama put up as any candidate and continues with that focus that she had, they go low, we go high, in terms of candidate style and issues, then the Democrats are going to lose again. The reason Republicans win is because they go for the throat. It works. And being nice in the campaign gets you nowhere. That's crazy.
So you see this then heading towards the nominating convention with no new surprise candidates, or even not so surprising candidates entering and emerging. We're going to be pretty much wedded to the candidates that are already in the race. And the last one, Bloomberg, you see that pretty much wrapped up then?
Yes, and I do. And I think that those who might mention, well, what about Hillary? Well, look, it's getting pretty late. Mm-hmm. That's the big issue you got to keep in mind. Campaigns are stretched throughout the country right now, and you can't just snap your fingers and say, here I am, and expect 50 million people to say, oh, goody. That's nuts. But that's not the way the politics works.
Even if they decided Hillary would be the savior, I mean, how would they sell her considering the disastrous results the last time and before that when she ran against Obama?
Well, I think that's what you got to look at. She's starting out with tremendous negatives, and she's got negatives that are nearly as bad as Trump's. Why would you put a candidate up like that even 4 years later and think that her negatives would be any better? That doesn't make any sense. And I think that, those who think that Hillary might become some last-minute candidate of reconciliation is just crazy. That doesn't make any sense.
So you don't see any way that she's going to enter, or they're going to allow her to enter or present her. That's already a dead issue.
I think it is, and I think that Tom Perez and Keith Ellison, the two people who are in charge of the Democratic Party, would never allow that to happen. They know the insurrection that would create among those candidates who've spent all this time and all this effort. And more importantly, to disenfranchise the voters of the Democratic primary process from taking revenge on them. That would be crazy. Just nuts.
All right, we've been talking with Bryant Thomas, a longtime newsman and lately of the Washington Bureau of AP. We're talking to Bryant on 103.5 FM WKCV in Pennsylvania. Bryant Thomas, thanks for being with us.
You've been listening to On Target with Larry Sparano, your source for what is, not what other medias tell you it is. Unbiased, unafraid, and always on target.